What was all the trouble about? Well, a first reading of the letter, and you would think it was about circumcision. That seems to be the thing that Paul's going for hard. Well, let's look at circumcision. Was he making a mountain out of a molehill? Why get so hot up about this little thing? If people want to be circumcised, that's okay. Was he justified in making such a song and dance about this Jewish custom of circumcision? A minor operation, the removal of part of the reproductive organ of the male, not practiced on the females in Judaism, though it is in certain tribes in Africa. It's now done for medical or social reasons. It's a widespread habit in the Semitic world, largely for hygienic reasons in that climate. But to the Jews, it had a religious significance. To the Jew, it was fundamental. There was a day when Hitler's Gestapo would just line up people in the streets of Berlin and make them drop their trousers to find out who they should cart off to the concentration camp. It's the mark of a Jew. And of course it was only on males, because in the Jewish world it is the male who inherits. And the inheritance passes down, the promises pass down through the male line. Therefore females were not circumcised. And it was a sign of eligibility to inherit the blessing promised to Abraham. And it was even said by God to Abraham that if any Jew was not circumcised, any Jewish male, he had to be thrown out of the people of God because he'd broken the covenant. Part of the covenant with Abraham was that every male descendant would bear this mark. So that to a Jew, this means everything. Three things that mean everything to the Jew are the Passover, the Sabbath, and circumcision. Whatever else they do or do not do, they may be liberal Jews or non-practicing Jews, but those three things still apply. Probably kosher food is the fourth that most would observe, but not all. But those three things of circumcision, the Sabbath and the Passover, those are an absolute must. Paul argues in Galatians that the promise made to Abraham was only intended for one male descendant of Abraham. That the word seed was singular, not plural. And that when God said to Abraham and his seed, he didn't mean to all his male descendants, but to one of them. And Paul argues that when that one male seed came, which was Jesus, then circumcision becomes obsolete. Because now it's been inherited. The one to whom it was promised has got it, so there's no point in circumcising anybody now. Do you follow the argument? And you'll find that in Galatians 3. So it was a sign of inheritance. Jesus had that sign. Jesus was circumcised, and he was the one who inherited. Paul had been circumcised as a Jewish male in his Jewish day, and he did actually circumcise Timothy. And Timothy came from Galatia. And yet Paul circumcised him. Why? Because he was going to accompany Paul in his missionary work, and Paul always went into the synagogue first and preached to Jews. And Timothy would never have managed to get in with him if he hadn't been circumcised. So Paul did it purely as an act of accommodation for evangelism, in the same way that C.T. Studd and others grew pigtails when they went to China to try and open a door to get alongside people. But here is Paul, who would circumcise Timothy from Galatia for that reason, who is now saying, how dare you consider it? And some people said, Paul, you're inconsistent. You circumcised Timothy. Why shouldn't we? So that's the occasion, and that's the situation. But behind circumcision lies something else. His language, by the way, reminds one again that the Bible is not a book for children, it's a book for adults. Tragedy is that most people stop reading it when they become adult. But it's not a children's book. But Paul really uses the strongest language. He says, I just wish those who would cut off your foreskins would go the whole hog and castrate themselves. Then they wouldn't be able to reproduce themselves. Strong language. Why is he saying this? At one point he says, if you have your foreskin cut off, you'll have Christ cut off from you. Now, very blunt, strong language, quite unlike some of his other letters. Why is he saying this? Why is he so against circumcision? The answer is because behind circumcision lay Judaism. And Judaism is, I'm afraid, still a religion of works. It's a religion of saving yourself by keeping the commandments. It's an impossible task, but so many people try it. And the danger of putting the 10 Commandments up on the wall is precisely that you're communicating to people, you've got to live this way in order to get right with God. And an outsider coming in is faced straight away with thou shalt. By the way, it's being said of some liberal scholars these days that they take the word not out of the 10 Commandments and put it into the creed. So that now the 10 Commandments are thou shalt commit adultery and thou shalt steal and thou shalt do all the other things. And the creed says, I do not believe in the virgin birth and I do not believe in the bodily resurrection. That's a rather neat criticism. But faced with all thou shalt nots, apart from anything else, it gives the impression that we're against everything, that we're negative, and that if you come anywhere near God, he'll stop you having fun. You know, that God is a thou shalt notter, and that he faces you straight away with the things you mustn't do. That's a tragic, negative impression that's given. But Judaism is essentially... Now, Christianity is rooted in Judaism, which in turn is rooted in the Old Testament, as we are. But how much of the former should be kept in the latter? How much of the Old Testament comes through to the New? How many of those 613 laws actually apply to us? That's one of the biggest questions you've got to face when you study the Old and the New Testament. Let me give you an example. I cannot ever tell Christians to tithe because it's an old covenant law and it belongs to the law of Moses. It's never mentioned in the New Testament when speaking to Gentile believers. Jews did it, but no Gentile believer was ever told to tithe. We are told to give. And I listened to a young man preaching on tithing, and he'd used his computer or his concordance, and he typed in tithing and got all the printouts. And he actually said this, and he was honest enough to say this. He said, there are blessings attached to tithing, and he gave us them all. You know, prove me now herewith if I don't open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing on you. And then he said, but there are curses attached to tithing as well, which is true. And he proceeded to tell us about a curse in the Old Testament, which is there, that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will suffer if we do not bring our tithes. And I looked at the face of the congregation, and boy, the fear of causing their great-grandchildren to suffer. And it's no wonder the offering was pretty big the following Sunday. But I was horrified. I said, that's wicked. In the New Testament, it's on altogether a different principle. The Lord loves a cheerful giver, which doesn't mean grin and bear it. It means that you want to give. That's what he's after now. Not people forced to give in case their great-grandchildren suffer. That belongs to the Old Covenant. Have I made it clear? Sabbath law is another one. Now, we've really got to think what we're doing before we apply Old Covenant laws to Christians. Because if you apply some of them, you must apply all of them. And if you apply the blessing, you must apply the curse. Now, are we prepared to do that? I'm not. See, I believe we've got to rethink this issue. And Paul is saying, if you get circumcised, that's just the camel's nose in the tent. And you'll soon have the hump and all. If you go the way of circumcision for the reason these teachers are teaching it, then all the other 613 laws will follow and come in. That's why he's so anxious. Not about circumcision itself, but it opened the door to Judaism. And he was finished with that. He'd tried it. He'd done his best at it. And it left him. In fact, he said, when I consider the commandments I've kept, not the ones I've broken, but the commandments I kept, he said, I feel like a little boy holding up his potty and saying, look what I've done. And he uses a very crude word in Greek for dung. I count it but dung, as a good Anglo-Saxon equivalent. He said, that's what it is, my self-righteousness. That's all it produced. And he said, thank God I'm delivered from all that.